Have you ever had to choose between the love of your life and the legacy of your family? What if the person you swore to spend your life with saw your heritage, your home, the very ground your grandfather bled for, as nothing more than a roadblock to a fancier car and a bigger house? For me, that wasn't a hypothetical question. It was my Tuesday. My name is Matt, and this is the story of how my wife tried to trade my family's 100-acre farm for a condo and a life of suburban boredom, and in doing so walked away from a fortune that would make kings blush. It all started, as these things often do, with an ultimatum. The hum of the fluorescent lights in the kitchen was the only sound, a high, thin whine that seemed to mock the silence between us. The papers sat on the oak table, a stark white rectangle on the dark, scarred wood. It was the final offer from Sterling Developments, a generous offer if you considered turning a century of history into a subdivision of cookie-cutter houses generous. To my wife Jessica, it was a winning lottery ticket. To me, it was a death certificate for my soul. She stood by the counter, arms crossed, her foot tapping a staccato rhythm of impatience on the linoleum. She hadn't looked at me in 10 minutes. Not really. Her gaze was fixed on the papers, as if her willpower alone could make my signature appear on the dotted line. "It's the final offer, Matt," she said, her voice clipped and devoid of the warmth I once cherished. "They're not going to wait forever. We've talked about this. We've done nothing but talk about this." I ran a hand over my face, the grit from a long day in the fields still clinging to my skin. "And I've told you, Jess, it's not for sale. This farm, this is everything my family built. My dad, my granddad, they're buried on that hill overlooking the creek." She finally turned to me, and her eyes, once my favorite shade of blue, were as hard and cold as river stones in winter. "They're gone, Matt. We're not. I'm tired of living hand to mouth. I'm tired of smelling like dirt and manure. I want a life. I want to go out to dinner without worrying if we can afford dessert. I want to see the world, not just the same 100 acres of mud and weeds day after day." Every word was a perfectly aimed dart. She knew how much I loved this land. She also knew I loved her, and she was using that love as a crowbar to pry me away from my own history. She called it a dirt patch, a dead end. She saw my refusal as a lack of ambition, a sign that I was content to be a failure, a simple farmer, clinging to the past. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. Because yesterday, while drilling for a new well down in the south pasture, the bit had plunged suddenly. It wasn't the familiar shudder of hitting bedrock or the gritty churn of an aquifer. It was a deep, resonant thud, followed by a surge of pressure that nearly knocked the rig off its feet. And then, the smell, acrid, rich, and unmistakable. I'd shut everything down, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I'd secretly called in a favor from an old college buddy, a geologist named Tom, begging him to come out under the guise of testing soil composition for a new crop rotation. He'd arrived this morning, while Jessica was at her part-time job in town. He took one look at the core samples, ran his tests, and then stared at me with wide, disbelieving eyes. He said it wasn't just a pocket, it was a reserve, a massive, untapped reservoir of sweet crude oil, the kind that made people obscenely, generationally wealthy. He'd used words like bonanza and geological miracle. He told me to tell no one, to get a lawyer who specialized in mineral rights, and to prepare for my entire world to change. And now, here I was, staring at an ultimatum from my wife. Sign the papers that would sell this geological miracle to a developer for pennies on the dollar, or she was leaving. She was giving me a choice, a life with her, built on the ashes of my heritage, or a life alone on my worthless farm. She thought she was giving me a final chance to shed my failure and join her in the real world. She had no idea she was standing on the brink of a fortune, about to turn her back on it all, because she couldn't see past the dirt on my boots. "So this is it," I said, my voice low. I looked from the papers to her face, searching for a flicker of the woman I married. I found none. "Sign, or you walk. I can't do this anymore, Matt," she said, her voice softening into a practiced manipulative caress. It was the voice she used when she wanted to make me feel like the unreasonable one. I love you, but I can't be a farmer's wife for the rest of my life. I'm not built for it. I need more. We deserve more. She used that word a lot, but we always seemed to mean she's. I picked up the pen. It felt impossibly heavy in my hand. Jessica's breath hitched, a tiny triumphant sound. She thought she had won. She thought her ambition, her relentless pushing, had finally broken me. I could feel her victory settling around her like a cloak. But she wasn't just walking away from a failed farmer. She was walking away from a man who was about to become one of the wealthiest people in the state, and she was about to do it by her own choice, driven by her own contempt for the very ground that held our future. It wasn't about revenge, not yet. At that moment, it was just about a profound, gut-wrenching sadness, but that I knew was about to change. Have you ever had to choose between the love of your life and the legacy of your family? What if the person you swore to spend your life with saw your heritage, your home, the very ground your grandfather bled for, as nothing more than a roadblock to a fancier car and a bigger house? For me, that wasn't a hypothetical question. It was my Tuesday. My name is Matt, and this is the story of how my wife tried to trade my family's 100-acre farm for a condo and a life of suburban boredom, and in doing so walked away from a fortune that would make kings blush. It all started, as these things often do, with an ultimatum. The hum of the fluorescent lights in the kitchen was the only sound, a high, thin whine that seemed to mock the silence between us. The papers sat on the oak table, a stark white rectangle on the dark, scarred wood. It was the final offer from Sterling Developments, a generous offer, if you considered turning a century of history into a subdivision of cookie-cutter houses generous. To my wife Jessica, it was a winning lottery ticket. To me, it was a death certificate for my soul. She stood by the counter, arms crossed, her foot tapping a staccato rhythm of impatience on the linoleum. She hadn't looked at me in 10 minutes. Not really. Her gaze was fixed on the papers, as if her willpower alone could make my signature appear on the dotted line. "It's the final offer, Matt," she said, her voice clipped and devoid of the warmth I once cherished. "They're not going to wait forever. We've talked about this. We've done nothing but talk about this." I ran a hand over my face, the grit from a long day in the fields still clinging to my skin. "And I've told you, Jess, it's not for sale. This farm, this is everything my family built. My dad, my granddad, they're buried on that hill overlooking the creek." She finally turned to me, and her eyes, once my favorite shade of blue, were as hard and cold as river stones in winter. "They're gone, Matt. We're not. I'm tired of living hand to mouth. I'm tired of smelling like dirt and manure. I want a life. I want to go out to dinner without worrying if we can afford dessert. I want to see the world, not just the same 100 acres of mud and weeds day after day." Every word was a perfectly aimed dart. She knew how much I loved this land. She also knew I loved her, and she was using that love as a crowbar to pry me away from my own history. She called it a dirt patch, a dead end. She saw my refusal as a lack of ambition, a sign that I was content to be a failure, a simple farmer, clinging to the past. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. Because yesterday, while drilling for a new well down in the south pasture, the bit had plunged suddenly. It wasn't the familiar shudder of hitting bedrock or the gritty churn of an aquifer. It was a deep, resonant thud, followed by a surge of pressure that nearly knocked the rig off its feet. And then, the smell, acrid, rich, and unmistakable. I'd shut everything down, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I'd secretly called in a favor from an old college buddy, a geologist named Tom, begging him to come out under the guise of testing soil composition for a new crop rotation. He'd arrived this morning, while Jessica was at her part-time job in town. He took one look at the core samples, ran his tests, and then stared at me with wide, disbelieving eyes. He said it wasn't just a pocket, it was a reserve, a massive, untapped reservoir of sweet crude oil, the kind that made people obscenely, generationally wealthy. He'd used words like bonanza, and geological miracle. He told me to tell no one, to get a lawyer who specialized in mineral rights, and to prepare for my entire world to change. And now, here I was, staring at an ultimatum from my wife. Sign the papers that would sell this geological miracle to a developer for pennies on the dollar, or she was leaving. She was giving me a choice, a life with her, built on the ashes of my heritage, or a life alone on my worthless farm. She thought she was giving me a final chance to shed my failure and join her in the real world. She had no idea she was standing on the brink of a fortune, about to turn her back on it all, because she couldn't see past the dirt on my boots. "So this is it," I said, my voice low. I looked from the papers to her face, searching for a flicker of the woman I married. I found none. "Sign, or you walk." "I can't do this anymore, Matt," she said, her voice softening into a practiced manipulative caress. It was the voice she used when she wanted to make me feel like the unreasonable one. "I love you, but I can't be a farmer's wife for the rest of my life. I'm not built for it. I need more. We deserve more." She used that word a lot, but we always seemed to mean she's. I picked up the pen. It felt impossibly heavy in my hand. Jessica's breath hitched, a tiny triumphant sound. She thought she had won. She thought her ambition, her relentless pushing, had finally broken me. I could feel her victory settling around her like a cloak. But she wasn't just walking away from a failed farmer. She was walking away from a man who was about to become one of the wealthiest people in the state. And she was about to do it by her own choice, driven by her own contempt for the very ground that held our future. It wasn't about revenge, not yet. At that moment, it was just about a profound, gut-wrenching sadness, but that I knew was about to change. The silence in the kitchen after she laid down her ultimatum was a living thing. It was heavy, suffocating, filled with the ghosts of 1,000 arguments we'd had over the past 5 years. Every one of them circled the same drain: this farm, my legacy, her prison. My refusal to sell wasn't just a business decision. In her eyes, it was a personal rejection of her and the life she craved, a life I apparently wasn't ambitious enough to provide. I sank into one of the old oak chairs, the wood groaning under my weight, the same chair my father used to sit in after a long day, his hands calloused and stained, but his eyes full of a quiet pride I now understood so deeply. He'd look out that very window at the fields stretching toward the horizon and say, "They're not making any more of it, Matty. This land, it's the only thing that's real." Jessica saw 100 acres of debt and drudgery. My father saw permanence. And I, caught between the woman I loved and the man I admired, was being torn in two. The developer's contract on the table felt like a betrayal to him, to his memory, to the very core of who I was. My mind drifted back, as it often did when I was under pressure, to the early days. I remembered meeting Jessica at a county fair. I was there selling some of our surplus corn and honey, and she was visiting a friend from college. She'd walked up to my stand, a city girl in a sundress, looking completely out of place and yet radiant. She'd laughed at my farmer's tan and bought a jar of honey, her fingers brushing mine as I handed it to her. There was an energy about her, a spark. She was fascinated by my life, or so I thought. She'd ask endless questions about the crops, the animals, the rhythm of the seasons. She said she was tired of the city's concrete and noise, that she dreamed of a simpler, more authentic life. I fell for it. I fell for her, hard. For the first couple of years it was perfect. She embraced the farm life. She'd help me mend fences, her hands clumsy but eager. She learned to make apple pie from my mother's recipe, the smell filling our small farmhouse with a sweetness that felt like a promise. We'd sit on the porch swing in the evenings, watching the fireflies, and she'd lay her head on my shoulder and tell me she'd never been happier. We were a team. It felt real. But slowly, things started to change. It was subtle at first. A comment here, a sigh there. Her friends from the city would visit, and I'd see a flicker of something in her eyes as they talked about their promotions, their European vacations, their new cars. She started spending more time in town, joining a book club, then a yoga studio. She took the part-time job at a boutique, she said, just to have something for herself. But it was more than that. It was an escape. The farm, which she once called romantic, became rustic. Rustic became rundown. My work, which was once noble, became grueling. The life she had claimed to want was now a cage. She was desperate to escape. The arguments started. Why couldn't we take a real vacation, not just a weekend in the next state over? Why couldn't we renovate the kitchen, get rid of my mother's ancient appliances? Why did I have to spend so much on a new tractor when we could just sell a few acres to cover our debts? Each question was a small chip at the foundation of our marriage. She didn't understand. The tractor wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity that allowed the farm to break even. The kitchen appliances worked just fine, and selling off acres was like selling a part of my own body. It was a violation of a trust that went back generations. My great-grandfather had bought this land after losing everything else. He'd cleared it with his bare hands. My grandfather had survived the Dust Bowl on this very soil. My father had turned down a dozen offers from developers in the 90s, telling them to go pound sand. He'd held on through drought, through floods, through recessions. He'd passed it on to me, not as a piece of real estate, but as a sacred duty. "It's our anchor, Matty," he'd told me a few months before he passed, his voice thinned by illness, but his grip on my arm still firm. We were sitting on the porch, looking at that same view. In a world that's always changing, always trying to sell you something you don't need, this land is your truth. Don't you ever let anyone convince you it's just dirt. I had promised him. And now, my own wife was the one trying to convince me it was just dirt. The ultimate betrayal wasn't just against me, but against him, against his memory. That thought, the memory of my father's face, was the spark that ignited the kindling of my despair into a cold, hard resolve. I looked at the contract again. The name on it was Sterling Developments, a faceless corporation that saw my home as Parcel 7B on a zoning map. They wanted to tear down the barn my great-grandfather built, the one with his initials carved into the main beam. They wanted to pave over the field where I'd first learned to drive a tractor. They wanted to bulldoze the hill where my parents were buried, to make way for a cul-de-sac named Whispering Pines or some other soulless generic label. And Jessica was their willing accomplice. She saw my hesitation with the pen as weakness. She saw my silence as me finally caving to the inevitable, but something had shifted inside me. The heartbreak was still there, a raw, open wound, but beneath it, something else was forming, a bedrock of anger, a quiet, unyielding certainty. The geologist's words echoed in my head, a massive, untapped reservoir, a bonanza, tell no one. This wasn't just about saving the farm anymore. It wasn't about honoring my father's memory. It had become about something more fundamental. It was about respect. My wife looked at me and saw a failure, a man without ambition clinging to a worthless piece of land. The world was about to find out just how ambitious I could be, but she wouldn't be there to see it. That was her choice, not mine. I thought about the future she envisioned, a sterile apartment, cocktail parties with people whose names she'd forget, a life measured in square footage and brand names, a life utterly detached from anything real, anything lasting. She was willing to trade the genuine for the synthetic, and she was demanding I do the same. No, the decision solidified in my chest, heavy and irreversible as concrete. I wasn't going to sign the papers. I wasn't going to sell, and I wasn't going to tell her why. If she couldn't love me as a farmer with dirt on his hands, she didn't deserve to be with me as a man who owned the ground beneath their feet. Let her walk away. Let her believe I was a fool. Let her make her choice based on the incomplete, contemptuous picture she had painted of me. Her decision to leave, based on that false premise, would be the most expensive mistake of her life. It wasn't about revenge. That's what I told myself in that moment. It was about principle. It was about integrity. But as I looked at her smug, expectant face, a colder, harder thought took root in my mind. It wasn't about revenge, until it was. I wouldn't just let her leave. I would make sure she understood with agonizing clarity exactly what she had thrown away. The breakdown was over. The resolve had set in. My new life started now, and my old life, the one with her in it, was about to end. I just had to play my part a little while longer. I took a deep breath, looked her straight in the eye, and said, "You're right, we need to think about our future." The lie tasted like ash in my mouth, but it was a necessary one. The curtain was rising on the final act of our marriage, and I was finally writing the script. The first phone call I made wasn't to a divorce lawyer. It was to my oldest friend, Caleb. We'd known each other since kindergarten, and while I'd stayed here to take over the farm, he'd gone to law school. He was a partner now, at a respectable firm in the city, but he'd never lost his small-town sense of right and wrong. He was the only person on the planet I could trust with this. "Caleb, it's Matt," I said, my voice low. I was out in the barn, the familiar scent of hay and old wood a comfort. I could hear the cows shifting in their stalls, a peaceful, rhythmic sound that was the complete opposite of the chaos in my head. "Matt, good to hear from you, man. Don't tell me you finally decided to sue old man Henderson for his wandering goats," he joked. "I wish it were that simple," I said, and the humor drained from his voice instantly. "What's wrong? You sound off." I took a deep breath and laid it all out. Jessica's ultimatum, the developer's offer, the pressure, the years of her growing discontent. I told him about my promise to my dad, and then I told him about the well. I told him what Tom the geologist had said, the words still feeling unreal as I spoke them. Bonanza, geological miracle. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. For a second, I thought the call had dropped. Then Caleb let out a low whistle. "Jesus, Matt, are you serious? Oil, like real oil?" "The realest," I confirmed. "And Jessica wants me to sell the whole damn thing for the price of a spec house in the suburbs. She's threatening to leave if I don't sign the papers by Friday." "Okay," Caleb said, and I could hear the shift in his tone. The friend was gone, and the lawyer had taken over. His voice was sharp, focused. "First thing, do not, under any circumstances, sign anything. Do not even hint to her or the developer that you know anything. Your ignorance is your greatest shield right now." "Did the geologist put anything in writing?" "No, he said it was better if he didn't. He wiped his equipment logs, said it was a verbal consultation between friends." "Good, Tom's a smart man. Second, we need to verify your mineral rights. Most of those old family deeds in our county are fee simple, meaning you own the surface and everything underneath it, but we have to be 100% certain. I'll pull the original deeds from the county records tomorrow morning. My dad always said we owned it, lock, stock, and barrel," I said. "I believe him, but in this game we don't believe, we verify," Caleb said. "Third, and this is the important part, we need to insulate you. And fast. If you officially become an oil baron overnight, and Jessica leaves, her divorce lawyer will argue she's entitled to half of that newfound wealth. We need to create a structure that protects the asset and separates it from your marital property, legally and ethically." "How do we do that?" I asked, feeling a surge of hope. This was why I called him. I knew how to run a farm, but this world of legal chess was completely foreign to me. "We form a new entity, a limited liability company, a corporation. We'll transfer the mineral rights of the farm to this new company. The key is the timing and the justification. We can argue it was a long-term estate planning move, something you were doing to protect the farm for future generations, completely independent of the oil discovery. It's a bit of a gray area, but it's a defensible position, especially since you haven't taken any steps to profit from the oil yet." He paused, and I could hear him typing furiously on his keyboard. "I'm thinking we call it Miller Creek Legacy Holdings." "Miller Creek, that's the name of the creek on your property, right? Sounds respectable, enduring. Not like Matt's Big Gusher LLC." I almost laughed. It felt good. Miller Creek Legacy Holdings. I like the sound of that. "I'll get the paperwork started tonight," he said. But Matt, there's something else. You mentioned your brother Leo. My gut tightened. Leo, my younger brother. He was the one who had gotten out. He'd seen the writing on the wall with Jessica years ago. He was a financial analyst in Chicago, sharp as a tack and twice as cynical. He and Jessica had clashed from day one. He saw her as a social climber. She saw him as a condescending jerk who thought he was too good for his family. They weren't both wrong. After one particularly nasty argument about money during a Christmas visit 5 years ago, Leo had mostly washed his hands of us. We spoke on birthdays and holidays, brief, awkward calls that skimmed the surface of our lives. What about him? I asked. You're going to need a partner in this new company, a board member, someone you trust implicitly who is not you. It adds another layer of legitimacy. And frankly, you're going to need someone who understands the kind of money you're about to deal with. That's not me. I'm a lawyer. Leo lives in that world. He's family. And from what you've told me, he has no love for Jessica. He'd be the perfect ally. Caleb was right, but the thought of calling Leo filled me with a familiar mix of shame and dread. I'd chosen my wife over my brother. I'd stood by while she drove a wedge between us, telling myself Leo was just being difficult. I hadn't listened to his warnings. Now I had to go to him, hat in hand, and admit he'd been right all along. That night, after a tense, silent dinner where Jessica kept shooting poisonous looks at the unsigned contract on the counter, I went back out to the barn. I stared at the phone for a long time before finally dialing his number. He picked up on the second ring. Matt, is everything okay? His voice was wary. I never called him at night. Yeah, everything's fine, I lied. Listen, Leo, I need to talk to you about something big. I told him the same story I told Caleb, but with more personal detail. I told him how empty the house felt, how Jessica looked at me with open disdain. I told him I was at the end of my rope, and then I told him about the oil. His reaction was different from Caleb's. There was no whistle, no shock, just a long, heavy silence. Then he said, "So, the prodigal farmer strikes it rich, and the loving wife who stood by him through thick and thin is about to get the boot. Is that the gist of it?" The cynicism in his voice stung, but I deserved it. "That's part of it," I admitted. "The other part is, you were right, about her, about everything. I was a fool, and I let her push you away. I'm sorry, Leo. It was the hardest thing I'd said all day, but it was the truest." The silence on the line stretched on, and I thought maybe he'd just hang up. Then he sighed, a deep, weary sound that seemed to carry 5 years of resentment with it. "It's not about being right, Matt. I just didn't want to see you get hurt. She sees people as stepping stones. I knew she'd get tired of the farm the second she realized it wasn't a quaint hobby she could tell her friends about." He paused. "So what do you need from me?" "Caleb. You remember Caleb, right? He's my lawyer now. He's setting up an LLC to hold the mineral rights. He thinks you should be on the board. A partner. He says I need someone who understands this world. I say I need my brother." Another silence. I could picture him in his high-rise apartment, looking out over the glittering lights of Chicago, a world away from our dusty farm. "Half, Matt," he said, his voice suddenly sharp and all business. "I'll do it. I'll fly in tomorrow. I'll help you navigate the sharks that are about to start circling. I'll make sure you don't get taken for a ride. But I want half of the company, 50%, not because I'm greedy, but because I want to make sure you can't be swayed by a tearful apology 6 months from now when she comes crawling back. I'll be the firewall that protects you from your own heart. That's my price for getting back in." Half. He wanted half of a fortune that could be worth hundreds of millions, maybe more. It was an audacious ask. A part of me bristled at the demand, but another deeper part of me understood it completely. It wasn't about the money for him either. It was his way of ensuring this couldn't happen again. It was the price of his trust. He was buying a controlling interest in our family's future, a future he'd been pushed out of. And he was right. I was still vulnerable. My heart was shattered. What if I did weaken? What if Jessica came back, crying, promising she'd made a terrible mistake? Leo would be the anchor, just as my father had said the land was, an anchor of cold, hard logic to keep me from drifting back into a toxic sea. Okay, I said, my voice hoarse. Okay, Leo, we have a deal. Good, he said, the cynicism gone, replaced by a grim determination. I'll be there tomorrow afternoon. Don't talk to anyone. Don't sign anything. And for God's sake, act miserable. Give her the performance of a lifetime. Let her think she's broken you. The bigger the fool she thinks you are now, the harder she'll fall later. I hung up the phone, my hand trembling slightly. My allies were in place. Ired B. Caleb, the legal shield. Leo, the financial sword. The secret plan was no longer just a desperate thought, it was a machine, oiled and ready to move. Hidden leverage wasn't just the oil under my feet, it was the brother I had finally brought back into my life. Jessica thought she was playing a simple game of chicken with a simple farmer. She had no idea I was now playing a three-dimensional chess match with pieces she couldn't even see. The next 2 days were the longest of my life. I had to live a lie, and it ate at me. I had to pretend to be the weak, defeated man Jessica believed me to be. I shuffled around the house, my shoulders slumped. I'd sit at the kitchen table staring at the contract from Sterling Developments, feigning a deep, agonizing conflict. I let my face get stubbled, my eyes look haunted. As Leo had said, I gave her the performance of a lifetime, and she bought every second of it. I could see the mixture of pity and triumph in her eyes. She'd soften her voice, place a hand on my shoulder, and say things like, I know this is hard, honey, but it's for the best. Think of our new life. A fresh start. Every word of fake sympathy was like turning a knife in my gut, but it also fueled the cold fire of my resolve. She wasn't just my wife anymore. She was my antagonist, and I had to see this through. On Wednesday afternoon, while Jessica was in town, a black sedan I didn't recognize rolled up the long gravel driveway. Leo stepped out, looking like he'd just walked off a trading floor in Chicago. He wore a tailored suit, no tie, and an expression of grim purpose. He gave the old farmhouse a long, critical look, then turned to me as I came out onto the porch. Still looks the same, he said. It wasn't a compliment. It's good to see you, Leo, I said, and I meant it. He gave me a brief, awkward hug. You look like hell, Matt. Good, keep it up. We went straight to the study, a small room lined with my father's old books on agriculture and history. Caleb was already there, having driven in from the city. He had a briefcase full of documents spread out on the desk. The three of us, a farmer, a lawyer, and a financier, were a council of war. Caleb got straight to the point. Good news, I pulled the deeds going back to 1919. Your great-grandfather was a smart man. The mineral rights were never severed. You own it all, free and clear. A wave of relief washed over me. So it's mine, it's ours. Leo corrected gently, looking at me. Lock, stock and barrel. He turned to Caleb. The LLC paperwork, Miller Creek Legacy Holdings, is officially incorporated as of this morning, Caleb said, sliding a folder across the desk. I've drafted the transfer of mineral rights from Matthew Miller, individual, to the LLC. We just need Matt to sign it. For consideration, the LLC will issue 100% of its shares to Matt. No, Leo said firmly. Change it. The LLC issues 50 shares to Matthew Miller and 50 shares to Leonard Miller. We do it now before a single dollar has been earned. We are co-founders of this venture. This needs to be clean. Caleb looked at me. I nodded. Do it. For the next hour, Caleb walked us through the legal maze. We were building a fortress of paper and law around my family's land. Leo was in his element, asking sharp questions about tax implications, liability shields, and corporate governance. He was thinking 10 steps ahead, about things I couldn't even comprehend. He was protecting me, not just from Jessica, but from a world of predators I didn't even know existed yet. As I signed the documents, my hand steady, transferring the unseen fortune beneath my feet into the company I now shared with my estranged brother, the weight on my shoulders felt a little lighter. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about reclaiming my family, not just my land. Leo stayed for 2 days, sleeping in his old childhood bedroom. He never once crossed paths with Jessica. He was a ghost in the house, a secret ally, working with me late into the night. We planned our next moves. The first silent takeover wasn't going to be of a company, it was going to be of the narrative. The developer, this Harrison guy, Leo said, scrolling through something on his tablet. He runs a publicly traded company, Sterling Developments. Their stock is propped up on future growth projections. They need this deal to look good to their investors. So, I asked. So we play with them, Leo said with a thin, ruthless smile. We let them think they're still in the game. We string them along right up to the deadline. Make them sweat. Make them eager. An eager buyer is a sloppy buyer. Caleb had another idea. I know a guy who does geological surveys, not a full-blown drilling analysis, but the kind of preliminary thermal and seismic scans a developer would do to assess foundation stability. He owes me a favor. We could have him generate a report. I saw where he was going. A report that finds nothing. A report that finds nothing but stable, boring, sedimentary rock, Caleb confirmed. Perfect for building houses on, completely uninteresting for anything else. We can even, hypothetically of course, make sure a copy of that report finds its way to Mr. Harrison's desk. It was brilliant. Devious and brilliant. We would reinforce their belief that this was just a simple land deal. We'd give them scientific proof that my farm was exactly what Jessica thought it was, a worthless dirt patch. It would make their final offer seem more than generous, and my refusal seem like the ramblings of a sentimental fool. The deadline was Friday at 5 p.m. On Thursday, Jessica's pressure campaign went into overdrive. Her text became a constant barrage. Have you signed yet? They're going to pull the offer, Matt. I saw a listing for a gorgeous condo downtown. We could be so happy. Don't do this to us. Don't throw away our future for a pile of dirt. I ignored them all. I let the pressure build. That evening, Mr. Harrison himself called. His voice was smooth, confident, but with an undercurrent of irritation. Matthew, Harrison here, just calling to check in. My people tell me the paperwork hasn't arrived. I hope we're not having second thoughts. I took a deep breath and channeled my inner broken farmer. I'm just having a hard time, Mr. Harrison. It's a lot to process. Of course, he said, his voice dripping with false empathy. But you know, Matthew, my team just got the preliminary geological survey back on your parcel. Solid bedrock. Great for development. My engineers are very pleased. But I'll be honest. The land itself is unremarkable. My offer is more than fair. In fact, it's generous, considering the lack of any other viable use for the property. It's this, or you're farming on it for the rest of your life. I had to physically stop myself from laughing. The fake report had landed. He was using our own disinformation against me. He thought he was holding all the cards, that he was educating the poor, ignorant farmer on the realities of his own land. I understand, I said, keeping my voice low and dejected. I'll have a decision for you by the deadline tomorrow. When I hung up, my heart was hammering. The silent takeover was in full swing. The enemy was confident, oblivious, and walking right into the trap we had set. Jessica's panic, however, was reaching a fever pitch. My calm misery was driving her insane. She couldn't understand why I wasn't jumping at the chance she'd given me. My inaction was a direct defiance of her will, and she wasn't used to it. The more I stalled, the more her condescending pity turned into raw, unfiltered anger. She saw the dream of her new life slipping through her fingers, and she blamed me entirely. "What is wrong with you?" She'd screamed at me on Thursday night. "It's right there, a fortune, everything I've been asking for, and you're just sitting there, staring at the walls like a zombie. "Are you trying to punish me? Is that it?" "I'm thinking," was all I said. That quiet response seemed to infuriate her more than any argument would have. She was losing control, and it terrified her. She was so blinded by her ambition, so certain of my weakness, she couldn't see the truth. She wasn't walking away from a failed farmer. She was being patiently, methodically, and silently ushered out the door. The first move was complete. The panic was setting in, and the final act was about to begin. Friday, the day of the ultimatum. The air in the farmhouse was thick with a tension, so palpable it felt like I was breathing water. Every tick of the grandfather clock in the hall sounded like a hammer blow, counting down the seconds to the 5 p.m. deadline. Jessica had been a storm of anxious energy all morning, pacing the kitchen, repeatedly checking her phone, and shooting me looks that could curdle milk. She couldn't comprehend my serenity. To her it was the calm of a man who had given up, a man resigned to his own failure. She had no idea it was the calm of a general watching his battle plan unfold perfectly. Around noon, she couldn't take it anymore. She stormed into the living room where I was sitting, pretending to read a book. She snatched the unsigned contract off the coffee table and waved it in my face. "That's it. I'm done waiting, Matt. Are you signing this or not? This is your last chance. Our last chance." I looked up from my book, meeting her gaze. I kept my expression placid, a mask of weary sorrow. "Jess, I can't," I said softly. "I just can't sell it." The color drained from her face. Her expression shifted from frustration to disbelief, then hardened into pure fury. For a moment, she was speechless. It was as if my quiet refusal was a physical blow. She had been so certain of her victory, so sure that her pressure, her threats, her love as a bargaining chip would ultimately break me. "You can't," she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. "You can't, or you won't. It doesn't matter which," I said, closing the book and setting it aside. "The answer is no." "You're a fool," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "A sentimental backwards fool. You would choose a patch of dirt over me, over a future, over a life where you don't have to worry about the price of feed every single day. This patch of dirt is my home. Jessica, it was my father's home. It's my legacy. Your legacy is failure," she shrieked, finally losing the last of her composure. "Your legacy is being broke and stubborn. I am not going to be dragged down with you. I gave you a choice. I gave you a way out, a way for us to be happy, and you're throwing it back in my face." She was right about one thing. I was throwing it back in her face. But it wasn't the future she imagined. It was her own shallow, materialistic vision of happiness that I was rejecting. She stood there, breathing heavily, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The beautiful woman I had fallen in love with at the county fair was gone, replaced by this stranger whose eyes shone with a cold, transactional fury. She wasn't mourning the end of our love. She was mourning the loss of a business deal. "Fine," she said, her voice dropping to an icy calm that was more terrifying than her shouting. "Fine, you've made your choice. Now I'll make mine." She turned on her heel and marched up the stairs. I didn't follow her, I just sat there listening. I heard drawers being yanked open, the scrape of hangers on the closet rod, the thud of a suitcase being thrown onto the bed. The sounds were methodical, efficient, and utterly final. This wasn't a bluff. This was the family exodus. This was the moment she had been threatening for months, finally brought to life by my defiance. An hour later, she came back down the stairs, pulling a large rolling suitcase behind her. She was wearing the clothes she'd worn on one of our first dates, a stylish dress and heels that looked completely out of place in the rustic farmhouse. It was a calculated, final insult, a visual statement that she was returning to the world she belonged in and leaving me behind in mine. She didn't look at me. She walked to the front door, her purse slung over her shoulder. Her hand rested on the doorknob. "The keys are on the kitchen counter," she said, her voice flat and empty. "I'll have my lawyer contact you about the divorce." She still thought she was the one in control, the one dictating terms. She thought the divorce would be simple: sell the farm, split the proceeds. She'd get her half of what she believed was a moderately valuable, but ultimately failing, business. It would be enough to get her started on her new life. I stood up and walked towards her. For a fleeting, insane moment, I almost broke. I almost told her everything. The old Matt, the man who loved her desperately, wanted to scream, "Don't go, you're making a terrible mistake. We're rich," but the new Matt, the one forged in the fire of her betrayal and an alliance with his brother, held his tongue. I looked at her, at the cold set of her jaw, and I knew she didn't deserve to know. She hadn't earned it. Loyalty couldn't be bought, and she had proven she had none to give. "I'm sorry it came to this, Jess," I said, and the apology was genuine. I was sorry for the man I had been, the man who hadn't been strong enough to see her for what she was sooner. She finally looked at me, a flicker of something, maybe surprise at my calm acceptance in her eyes. But it was quickly replaced by a sneer of contempt. "You will be," she said. "One day, when you're old and alone on this miserable farm, you'll remember this day, and you'll know you threw away the best thing that ever happened to you." She opened the door. The late afternoon sun streamed in, silhouetting her for a moment. "Have fun with your dirt patch, Matt," she said, the words dripping with scorn. "I'm going to have a real life." And then she was gone. The door clicked shut behind her, the sound echoing through the suddenly cavernous house. I heard her car start, the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway, and then silence. A profound, absolute silence. It was over. She was gone. She had walked away, just as she promised she would. She thought she was walking away from a failed farmer and a dead-end life. She thought she had lost a battle, but was on her way to winning the war for her own happiness. I walked to the window and watched her car disappear down the road until it was just a tiny speck. I felt a pang of loss, a deep, sorrowful ache for the marriage that had died long before this moment. But underneath it, I felt something else growing stronger, a sense of liberation, a sense of quiet, unassailable power. She had given me an ultimatum, thinking she held all the power, but she had no idea about the real ultimatum, the one the universe had presented to her. She had been given a choice, not between a farm and a condo, but between loyalty and greed, between love and ambition, between a man and his money. She had chosen wrong, and the consequences of that choice were going to be more spectacular than she could ever imagine. The vindication was coming. I just had to be patient. The weeks after Jessica left were the quietest of my life. The silence in the house was a constant presence, a reminder of what I had lost, but also what I had gained: peace. There were no more arguments, no more condescending sighs, no more pressure to be someone I wasn't. It was just me, the land, and the secret humming beneath it. My days were spent working on the farm, the familiar physical labor a balm for my bruised heart. But my nights were spent on the phone with Caleb and Leo, planning. We moved with quiet efficiency. Leo, through his network, arranged for a discreet sale of a small percentage of Miller Creek Legacy Holdings' future drilling rights to a private equity firm specializing in energy. It wasn't a public deal, just a quiet transaction that filled our new company's coffers with millions in seed money. It was enough to begin operations without attracting unwanted attention. We weren't a wildcatter with a lucky strike anymore. We were a legitimate energy company. Leo hired a PR firm and a project manager. We filed the necessary drilling permits with the state under the LLC's name. Everything was moving forward, a silent, powerful machine grinding away behind the scenes, while the world saw nothing but a lonely farmer tending his fields. I received the divorce papers from Jessica's lawyer, just as she'd promised. They were exactly what I expected. They demanded the immediate sale of all marital assets, principally the 100-acre Miller farm, with a 50-50th split of the proceeds. Her lawyer, working off the developer's generous but now defunct offer, estimated my net worth at a respectable but not life-changing figure. Caleb responded on my behalf. We didn't contest the divorce. We didn't fight the 50-50th split. We agreed to everything. We just provided our own, meticulously documented appraisal of the farm's value. The appraisal was based on its use as agricultural land, its primary and only publicly known function. The value was fair, honest, and about 1/3 of what the developer had offered. The transfer of the mineral rights to the LLC, which had occurred before she filed for divorce, was a separate corporate matter, not a marital asset. I could only imagine the furious phone call Jessica must have had with her lawyer. She had walked away from a multi-million-dollar developer deal, and now I was offering her half of a humble farm's agricultural value. Her greed had backfired spectacularly. She had overplayed her hand, and now she was left with almost nothing. The divorce was finalized quickly and quietly. She got a check that was to her an insult. To me, it was the price of my freedom. 3 months after she left, the first drilling rig arrived. It was a massive skeletal tower that rose against the morning sky, a symbol of the new reality. The news couldn't be contained anymore. A local reporter got wind of the permits and came out to the farm. I gave him a short, simple interview, crediting a newly formed local energy cooperative with the discovery. I was just the landowner, a humble farmer who'd partnered with them to help revitalize the local economy. The story ran on the local evening news. Local farmers' land hides black gold. Miller Creek gusher could bring economic boom. They showed footage of the rig, the crew, and a brief, awkward interview with me in my work clothes, talking about honoring my father's legacy by using the land to build a future for the community. I knew she would see it. I didn't know when or how, but I knew. The confrontation came 2 days later. I was standing on the porch, watching the evening sun cast long shadows across the fields, when a sleek, expensive-looking rental car came speeding up the driveway, spitting gravel. It screeched to a halt, and Jessica flew out of the driver's side. She looked different. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless. She wore a designer dress that probably cost more than my first tractor. She looked like the woman she had always wanted to be. But her face was a mask of disbelief and incandescent rage. She marched right up to me, her eyes wild. She didn't stop until she was inches from my face. "Oil," she breathed, the word a mix of accusation and awe. There was oil? All this time, I didn't say a word. I just looked at her, my expression unreadable. My silence was my new power. "You knew," she accused, her voice rising, "when you were drilling that well. When I was begging you to sign the papers, when I left, you knew this was here, and you let me walk away." "You didn't walk away from oil, Jessica," I said, my voice calm and even. It was the first time I had spoken to her since the day she left, and the sound of my own quiet confidence surprised even me. "You walked away from me. You walked away from this farm. You called it a dirt patch. You said my legacy was failure. The oil didn't change any of that. It just revealed it." Her face crumpled. The fury was replaced by a desperate, panicked realization. She was seeing the condo, the vacations, the life of luxury she had craved, all turning to dust before her eyes. "Matt, we can fix this," she stammered, reaching for my arm. Her touch felt alien. The divorce just went through. We can get remarried." It was a mistake. I was stressed. I wasn't thinking clearly. "I love you. I've always loved you." It was a pathetic, transparent performance. The practiced, manipulative charm was back, but it was hollow, stripped of all its power. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the drilling rig on the horizon. I gently removed her hand from my arm. "No, Jess," I said, not unkindly. "You don't love me. You love what I have. And you're right, you did make a mistake. You thought I was weak. You thought my love for this land was a character flaw. But it turns out, it was my greatest asset." I stepped back and pulled a folded newspaper from my back pocket. It was today's financial section. I handed it to her. The headline was about a new player in the energy sector, Miller Creek Legacy Holdings, and its shockingly successful initial drilling results. There was a picture of the board members, me, looking uncomfortable in a borrowed suit jacket, and next to me, smiling a cool, confident smile, was my brother Leo. She stared at the picture, her mouth opening and closing silently. The sight of Leo, her old adversary, now my business partner, was the final devastating blow. She understood then. This wasn't a lucky accident. This was a plan, a coordinated, deliberate act of self-preservation that had completely excluded her. "You and Leo," she whispered, the paper trembling in her hand. "You planned this." "Leo and I reconnected," I said simply. "Family looks out for family." The new reality settled over her, cold and absolute. She hadn't just walked away from me, she had been cast out. She had been deemed untrustworthy by the very family she had tried to tear apart. She looked at me one last time, her eyes filled with a mixture of hatred, regret, and a dawning, soul-crushing understanding of the sheer magnitude of her miscalculation. She had held a winning lottery ticket in her hand and had chosen to tear it up because she didn't like the paper it was printed on. Without another word, she turned, got back in her expensive rental car, and drove away, much slower this time. I watched her go, and for the first time I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, no triumph, just a quiet, profound sense of closure. The vindication wasn't in the money or the power, it was in that final, silent acknowledgement. She finally saw me, not as a failed farmer, but as the man who had built a kingdom on the very ground she despised, and she could never ever be a part of it. Life is different now. The drilling rigs are a permanent feature on the horizon, their rhythmic pumping a constant reminder of the fortune that lies beneath my feet. But the farmhouse is the same. The barn my great-grandfather built still stands, now lovingly restored. The porch swing still squeaks. I still walk the fields every morning, not because I have to, but because I want to. The land is still my truth, my anchor. The money didn't change that. It just gave me the freedom to preserve it. With Leo's guidance, Miller Creek Legacy Holdings has grown beyond anything I could have imagined. We're a major employer in the county. We've set up a community foundation, funding scholarships, new equipment for the local hospital, and programs to help other local farmers modernize and thrive. My father's legacy isn't just in the soil anymore, it's in the lives we're able to change for the better. It turns out my ambition wasn't to leave the farm but to lift it up, and the entire community with it. Leo and I are closer than we've ever been. The wound between us has healed, replaced by a deep, unspoken respect. He handles the business end of things from Chicago, but he flies in once a month. We don't just talk about oil futures and profit margins. We sit on the porch, drink a beer, and talk about Dad. We're brothers again. The money was just the catalyst that allowed us to find our way back to each other. As for Jessica, I hear things from time to time. She got her settlement, a sum that seemed insulting to her but would have been a windfall for us just a year ago. She tried to live the life she always wanted, but without the endless river of cash she'd envisioned, it didn't quite work out. The condo was smaller, the vacations less exotic. Her friends, the ones who had fueled her discontent, lost interest when she couldn't keep up. Last I heard, she was working at another boutique, selling expensive clothes to women who had the life she thought she was owed. She got the surface-level existence she craved, but it's a lonely one. She has no anchor. Sometimes I wonder if I was too cruel, letting her walk away without a word of warning. But then I remember her face, the contempt in her eyes as she called my home a dirt patch. Her ultimatum wasn't a cry for help. It was a demand for my surrender. She didn't want a partner. She wanted a prize. She didn't value my character, only my potential net worth. The oil didn't create the flaw in our marriage, it merely illuminated it in the harshest possible light. It was a test of loyalty, and she failed spectacularly. It wasn't about revenge, but the justice of it all does bring a quiet sense of satisfaction. She got exactly what she deserved. A life without me, and without the legacy she was too blind to see. This whole experience taught me a powerful lesson. Your worth isn't defined by your job title or the size of your bank account. It's defined by your integrity, by your loyalty to the things that matter, family, history, and the promises you keep. Some people, like Jessica, are so busy chasing a fantasy of what they think life should be that they fail to appreciate the real, tangible value of what's right in front of them. They see a field of dirt and miss the treasure buried beneath. They see a simple life and miss the profound richness within it. So I want to ask you, have you ever felt undervalued by someone who was supposed to be your biggest supporter? Have you ever had your passion dismissed as a pointless hobby or your legacy treated like a burden? Let me know in the comments below. I'm sure many of you have stories of your own and I'd genuinely like to hear them. It's important to remember that true wealth is about more than just money. It's about being true to yourself even when the person closest to you asks you to be someone else. Thanks for listening to my story, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more content about getting the last laugh when you're underestimated. You won't regret it.